This video is about two of the first campaigners for gay rights in the modern era, two men who invented the modern idea of homosexuality. There's Karl Ulrichs, a man who outed himself way back in 1862 to campaign for homosexual law reform, and Karl Kerbeny, the man who came up with the words and the idea of homosexual and heterosexual. A lot of people don't realise that the campaign for gay rights goes back a long, long way, over 160 years. So I made this video to tell you that early story. Hi, my name is Simon Dawson, and welcome to my Switching View project. In these videos, I explore the history of homosexuality, especially how sexuality overlaps with religion and spirituality, and it's quite a contested field. Doing this work, I come to realise that there's a problem with the word homosexual. Different people have got different theories as to what that word actually means. Because the word means different things to different people, then discussing homosexuality can get quite confusing. So I plan to make a series of videos called Talking About Homosexuality to try to bring some clarity to that debate. I'll be looking at the research and what scholars, especially gay scholars, have said homosexuality is. And I'll be looking at the science and what modern science has said about how homosexuality evolved and why it's there. So look out for those videos. They'll be listed on my website as they're made. But this first video is simply about two heroes of the gay rights movement who were there in that debate right from the start. So let's start with Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. Ulrichs was born in 1825 in Hanover, what is now Germany, into a wealthy middle-class family. As a youngster, he said he felt different to other boys, effeminate, attracted by bright colours, dolls and clothing. And then, aged 14, he had his first sexual experience with his riding instructor. After university, he trained as a lawyer and then became a judge, and he always had this professional interest in the law. And then in 1862, he started work on his gay rights campaign. There was a strong move at the time for German unification, led by Prussia. And as a lawyer, Ulrichs was concerned that the vicious Prussian anti-sodomy laws might be imposed on all of the rest of Germany, and this was his inspiration. In 1862, he came out first to his family and explained his understanding of himself in a long series of letters, which are now fascinating for researchers. And then in 1864 to 1880, he published 12 essays, Studies of the Riddle of Male-to-Male Love. Initially, these were anonymous, but eventually they were published under his real name. And then in 1867, he gave a speech on law reform to the Congress of German jurists. This was shouted down with protests, but still, it was the first ever gay rights speech in the modern era. I should say here that if you want to find out more about anything I mention, then for every video on my channel, I'll produce a text and resources PDF document, which gives you guidance about further reading. For example, in the PDF for this video, there's a link which gives you the full text of Ulrich's speech, and you can find links to these documents on my website. After his speech to the German jurists, Ulrichs moved around Germany for the next 15 years, speaking, writing, campaigning. He's often in trouble with the police, and his papers sometimes confiscated. But the Dao moved slowly, and the idea of studying sexuality as an academic discipline developed. He linked up with other people and developed his ideas. Doctors and medical men began to research the issue. The most famous of them, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, says he was inspired to do so by Ulrich's work. And gay law reform became a matter for public debate. But sadly, Ulrich's campaign to change the law eventually failed. And so in 1879, he moved to Italy and lived in some poverty and exile. He died in 1895. But he lived just long enough to see his work begin to get public recognition. He is now well known as a major gay rights pioneer, described by one writer as the world's first out gay man. I spent some time on Ulrich's campaigning life because that's important and deserves recognition. But what's just as important are his ideas on sexuality. He was the first person to actually research properly what homosexuality is and to publish his results. And what is astonishing, I find, is how much he seemed to get right. Some of his basic ideas are, I think, still valid and useful today. Ulrich's ideas on sexuality developed over 15 years as he met and worked with more and more people. But he put forward three basic ideas right from the start, which he stuck with throughout. Firstly, homosexuality is an innate or inborn disposition. Secondly, that sexuality is formed in the womb. And thirdly, homosexuality is linked in some way to the intersection of male and female within the person. Let's take those three ideas in turn. At the time, homosexuality was seen as more of a physical act, something that one did, sodomy, an act that one chose to do against God's law or against the laws of the land out of moral degradation. But Ulrichs began to argue that instead homosexuality was innate or inborn. It's an instinct that people had because that's the way that they were made, the way that they were born. That people came out of the womb almost programmed to be gay. Ulrichs used the analogy of intersex to explain what might have happened in the womb. Just as it's possible for a child to be born physically intersex, with a body containing aspects of both male and female, it is possible for a child to be born which is psychically intersex, a body which may be male, but parts of the psyche or soul or mind which are more like a female. A class of individuals who are born with the sexual drive of a woman, but who have male bodies. And if such people are in essence partly female, then for them the love of a man would be entirely natural and normal, and therefore society ought to accept such people socially and legally. Ulrichs is quite well known for this female psyche in a male body theory, and he's been criticised for it by many people as being too simplistic. But to be fair, this basic statement is one of his early ideas, when at the time he said he only knew 6 other homosexual people, so he had little to go on apart from his own personal life experience. But as he met more and more people and had more data to go on, he developed and expanded his ideas. He met people who rejected his male-female linkage, and he saw homosexuality as simply being another way of being a man. And he met people who we might today consider to be transgender, and had to reconsider in what way a homosexual had this female psyche, which is different to a transgender psyche, who's constantly re-evaluating and issuing new essays. Just to give one small example of the way that Ulrichs expanded his ideas, he started off with the categories of Urning and Dioning as basically gay or straight, and these two names come from Greek mythology. He then enlarged into a sort of spectrum with the more masculine manling at one end, the more effeminate weaveling at the other, and the Vishkan Urning somewhere in the middle. And each of these individual categories would be attracted to a certain type of male person, often on an opposites attract basis. And this is the sort of increasing complexity that Ulrichs developed over 15 years. But Ulrichs did recognise the problems with this sort of work. Human beings are vastly complex and vastly different. So no matter how many categories you create, a huge number of people will not fit neatly into what you describe. It's time to turn now to Karl Kertbeny. Kertbeny and Ulrichs were near contemporaries. For a time they corresponded together and exchanged ideas. But despite that, Kertbeny and Ulrichs were very different types of people. Ulrichs was deliberately out and proud, whilst Kerbeny was anxious and secretive, and his published works were anonymous. Because of that anonymity, a lot of his ideas have been attributed wrongly to other people. It's only in the last few decades that researchers have uncovered exactly what Kerbeny did and how he influenced the gay rights campaign. And so it's time to put the record straight. Karl Kerbeny was born in Vienna in 1824, which makes him a year older than Ulrichs. He was Hungarian. He travelled widely around Europe. In public, he worked as a journalist, book dealer, soldier and wine exporter. But for a brief time, he had a secret life as a gay rights campaigner. Between 1865 and 68, he corresponded with Karl Ulrichs. And in a letter dated May the 6th, 1868, is the first ever recorded use of the words homosexual and heterosexual. And then in 2 anonymous pamphlets dated 1869 are the same words used for the first time in published form. That's not much to go on, but Kerbeny also left a set of personal diaries which scholars have used to reconstruct his life and work. One has to wonder about Kerbeny's motivations for doing this sort of work. He says he was heavily influenced by the suicide of a young friend who was being blackmailed for being gay, and he always said in public that he was straight. But if you look at the way he describes certain young men in his diaries, and his anxiety about secrecy, one has to wonder whether he was in fact a closeted homosexual. But with little to go on, we can never be certain. Turning now to Kerbeny's theories and ideas, if he's mentioned at all in most books, it's simply for inventing the word homosexual. But he did a lot more than that and had more complex ideas. The key thing to realise is that he came up with two words, homosexual and heterosexual, as a binary, and his basic idea was equality. Whatever law you have to control and manage sexuality, then you must apply the law equally to homosexual and heterosexual alike. Kertbeny started with a more complex description of the human innate disposition to sexuality. There were monosexuals for masturbation, heterogenate an attraction towards animals, and two different ways of having an attraction to the opposite sex. For those who are same-sex attracted, about 75% were mutuals, interested only in mutual masturbation, whilst 25% were pegistane, involved in anal sex. Over time, however, most of these words faded away, and only homosexual and heterosexual stayed in constant use. The problem, however, was that these words were so useful that many people used them in their own work and gave them definitions and meanings which were very different from what Kerbeny originally implied. The fact that the word homosexual has been used by many different people and given many different meanings has been the cause of much misunderstanding and confusion over the years. In his letters and pamphlets, Kerbeny focused on three main issues: the law and innate disposition, equality before the law, and personal consent. In his letters, Kerbeny agreed with Ulrichs that homosexuality was an innate disposition. Nature, in its sovereign temperament, creates the homosexual instinct, which might be an inborn and therefore unsurpassable drive. But, Kerbeny argued, the law is not concerned about biology. The law only cares about what causes harm and how to control that harm. You could have an innate disposition to be an arsonist or a psychopath, but that would not be a valid defence in law. In focusing his legal campaign so much on biology, then Ulrichs was basically wasting his time. Some of Kerbeny's writing is quite feisty and well worth reading, so I'll flash up some slides showing what he says whilst I speak. I won't slow the video by reading it out, but feel free to pause the video to read it for yourself if you wanted to. When you look at how the law controls harm, Kertbeny's main argument was equality before the law. For example, anal sex was criminal when carried out between men, but perfectly legal when carried out between people of the opposite sex. This was, he said, an outrageous inconsistency, not based on any rational assessment, but on a 1,000-year-old confusion of terms. He wrote that if you actually look at the evidence, then homosexuals and monosexuals are much less harmful in their behaviour than the perfectly legal excesses of heterosexuals in society. And he was quite outspoken in his criticism of heterosexual behaviour. For example, he described assaulting female minors. This was in a country where the age of consent was very low. In parts of Germany, it was perfectly legal for a grown man to marry a 12-year-old girl, to have sex, and to make her pregnant. I think this is the key point in Kerbeny's arguments, for which he is not given enough credit. He didn't just invent the one word, homosexual. He invented two words, homosexual and heterosexual, to describe the full range of human sexuality. And whatever law you come up with to control the harm caused by that sexuality, it needs to be applied equally to all, homosexual and heterosexual alike. Kertbeny's final argument was about consent. The law should only control what causes harm to other people, and people should be free to consent to what affects only themselves, even if what they choose has severe and negative consequences. If you want to sum up Kerbeny, I think there's two things to say. Firstly, he deserves credit for getting involved. He may have wanted to stay anonymous in a homophobic culture, but the things he did manage to say anonymously inspired and informed many other people. But also he was astonishingly forward-looking, not just writing about sexuality, but also writing about the law. When writing about the law, he said it should have three foundations: regulating harm, equality before the law, and personal consent. And that is almost exactly how the law on sexuality is written in Europe today, 160 years later. And that is pretty astonishing coming from a bookseller and wine importer with apparently no legal training. Kerbeny deserves to be much more widely known and widely praised for what he did. Before I end this video, let me talk about where I'm going next. I've called this video series Talking About Homosexuality. Homosexuality is a very confusing issue with lots of very contested questions. How do you become homosexual? Is it a perfectly natural and normal variation in the human condition, or is it a pathology? Something has gone wrong. How did homosexuality evolve or appear in human history? There's lots of different theories, and some of them are quite contested, lots of disagreement. So all I can do is explain my own ideas, what I think is going on. So in these videos, I'll be describing the work of 6 key gay writers who gave their answers over 150 years. It's a bit like building a jigsaw puzzle. In this video, I'll describe the work of Karl Kerbeny and Karl Ulrichs, who worked in the 19th century. That's the first 2 jigsaw pieces. Then in the next video, I'll move to the 20th century and describe the works of Edward Carpenter, Magnus Hirschfeld, Harry Hay, and Michel Foucault. I think those 6 people together can give a very clear picture of what homosexuality is and how it works. To me, it's vitally important that I use gay writers in these videos, and what happens to Ulrichs and Kerbeny will explain why. Once these 2 had started the discussion, the floodgates opened, and lots of people got involved. One of them was a guy called Richard von Krafft-Ebing, a famous German psychiatrist. Krafft-Ebing freely acknowledges his debt to Ulrichs in his own books, and he uses Kerbeni's terminology. But Krafft-Ebing was a psychiatrist whose speciality was the intersection of psychiatry and the criminal law. So he took over Ulrichs' ideas, but introduced his own set of values. Homosexuality was a hereditary nervous disease. It was an innate neuropathic disorder. It was a malformation. But because Krafft-Ebing was a famous doctor, then it was his ideas that got published and were given widespread prominence, whilst Ulrichs and Kerbeny faded into obscurity. And it's this straight-explaining by people like Krafft-Ebing I'll be describing and pushing back against in these videos, because surely gay people should be regarded as experts in their own condition, and gay people should demand the right to define for themselves exactly what homosexuality is. This is the end of the video, but before I leave you, here's a few things you can do if you want to find out more for yourself. Firstly, on the website there are downloadable text and resources documents which list all the books, websites and articles I've used in this video. There's also some web pages labelled discussion, definitions and laws. These explore all the ideas in much more detail, almost academic detail, than I can do in this short video. If you subscribe to the YouTube channel, you'll get sent an email each time I upload a new video. And if you can please click the like button, it makes YouTube more likely to recommend these videos to other people like you. Just to remind you, the next video will be that jigsaw of 6 gay writers I've already mentioned. And then I'll do one more about modern science. There's been some fantastic work only in the last 20 years, and I'll be exploring that. Who knew, for example, that over 1,500 animal species display homosexual behaviour? And that tells us something interesting about how homosexuality evolved. The human biology is also interesting, and that links back to this video on Karl Ulrichs. Thinking back to Ulrichs, his key ideas were that homosexuality was in some way innate or inborn, in some way formed in the womb, and in some way involving the overlap of male and female within the person. Those ideas have been hugely contested. Many people disagree strongly with those statements even today. But Ulrichs might have been right. Looking at the human biology, it seems that even for a straight-acting, cisgendered gay man like me, parts of my brain are structured more like a straight woman's brain than a straight man's. And although the evidence is less strong but developing, it may well be that that is because of the way that hormones flow over the developing fetus in the womb. Ulrichs may have been right all along. And at that point, I'll leave you. Bye.